Hello, hello, and welcome to another dramatic reading of the novel Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. And I'm your reader, Nick Sal, and I just want to point out, if you're coming from the first video I did, apologies that I was running a new recording service that had a plugin that could remove some dead air, like some dramatic pauses, and I thought I had to turn on the bare minimum, and I realized it chopped out some pause times in the movie. So if you saw it kind of jump around on you, it's just removing times when I was pausing for a second or two. So sorry about that if it's a little jumpy. It took you by surprise. I've turned that plugin off. You're not going to experience that for the future of the reading. All right. Just like to get that out of the way. But good evening to you all. At least it's evening where I'm at right now. Hope you're tucking in for a good read. That's what I felt like doing. Great way to end the day is to dive into some good literature, right? Especially some as intriguing as what we've seen now. Let's follow the author now as he's communicating with this gorilla. Chapter 3. And the gorilla is speaking at the very beginning of the chapter. In such places, he went on at last, where animals are simply penned up, they're almost always more thoughtful than their cousins in the wild. This is because even the dimmest of them cannot help but sense that something is very wrong with this style of living. When I say that they are more thoughtful, I don't mean to imply that they acquire powers of ratiocination. Rarely stumped by a word, but ratiocination. Halfway down page 12. But the tiger you see madly pacing its cage is nevertheless preoccupied with something that a human would certainly recognize as a thought. And this thought is a question. Why? 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 The tiger asks itself hour after hour, day after day, year after year, as it treads its endless path behind the bars of its cage. It cannot analyze the question or elaborate on it. If you were somehow able to ask the creature, "Why what?" it would be unable to answer you. Nevertheless, this question burns like an unquenchable flame in its mind, inflicting a searing pain that does not diminish until the creature lapses into a final lethargy that zookeepers recognize as an irreversible rejection of life. And of course, this questioning is something that no tiger does in its normal habitat. Before long, I too began to ask myself, why? Being neurologically far in advance of the tiger, I was able to examine what I meant by the question, at least in a rudimentary way. I remembered a different sort of life, which was, for those who lived it, interesting and pleasant. By contrast, this life was agonizingly boring and never pleasant. Thus, in asking why, I was trying to puzzle out why life should be divided in this way, half of it interesting and pleasant, and half of it boring and unpleasant. I had no concept of myself as a captive. It didn't occur to me that anyone was preventing me from having an interesting and pleasant life. When no answer to my question was forthcoming, I began to consider the differences between the two lifestyles. The most fundamental difference was that, in Africa, I was the member of a family, of a sort of family that your people, of your culture, haven't known for thousands of years. If gorillas were capable of such an expression, they would tell you that their family is like a hand, of which there are the fingers, of which they are the fingers. Excuse me tonight, folks, warming up. They are fully aware of being a family, but are very little aware of being individuals. Here in the zoo, there were other gorillas, but there was no family. 5 severed fingers do not make a hand. Ooh, power line there. Halfway down, page 13. 5 severed fingers do not make a hand, do they? I considered the matter of our feeding. Human children dream of a land where the mountains are ice cream and the trees are gingerbread and the stones are bonbons. For a gorilla, Africa is just such a land. Wherever one turns, there is something wonderful to eat. One never thinks, "Oh, I'd better look for some food. Food is everywhere, and one picks it up almost absent-mindedly as one takes a breath of air. In fact, one does not think of feeding as a distinct activity at all. Rather, it's like a delicious music that plays in the background of all activities throughout the day. In fact, feeding became feeding for me only at the zoo, where twice daily great masses of tasteless fodder were pitched into our cages. It was in puzzling out such matters as these that my interior life began, quite unnoticed. Although naturally, I knew nothing of it. The Great Depression was taking its toll on all aspects of American life. Zoos everywhere were being forced to economize, reducing the number of animals to be maintained and thereby reducing expenses of all kinds. A great many animals were simply put down, I believe, for there was no market in the private sector for animals that were neither easy to keep nor very colorful or dramatic. The exceptions were, of course, the big cats and the primates. To make a long story short, I was sold to the owner of a traveling menagerie with an empty wagon to fill. I was a large and impressive adolescent and doubtless represented a sensible, long-term investment. You might imagine that life in one cage is like life in any other cage, but this is not at all the case. Take the matter of human contact, for example. At the zoo, all the gorillas were aware of our human visitors. They were a curiosity for us, worth watching, in the way that birds or squirrels around a house might seem worth watching to a human family. So great to get this perspective, right? Like, wow. I mean, I don't know how Daniel Quinn could tap into what I'm sure is really like the perspective of probably how primates, or gorillas in this case, might process the outside world. Really, really good empathy here. And of course, I've lost my place. Sorry about that. The gorillas were aware. These squirrels, yes. Human family. It was clear that these strange creatures were there looking at us, but it never crossed our minds that they had come for that express purpose. At the menagerie, however, I quickly came to a true understanding of this phenomenon. Indeed, my education in this regard began from the moment I was first put on display. A small group of visitors approached my wagon and after a moment began speaking to me. I was astounded. At the zoo, visitors had talked to one another, never to us. Perhaps these people are confused, I said to myself. Perhaps they've mistaken me for one of themselves. My wonderment and perplexity grew as, one after another, every group that visited my wagon behaved in the same way. I simply didn't know what to make of it. That night, without thinking of it as such, I made my first real attempt to marshal my thoughts to solve a problem. Was it possible, I wondered, that changing my location had somehow changed me? I didn't feel in the least changed, and certainly nothing in my appearance seemed to have changed. Perhaps, I thought, the people who visited me that day belonged to a different species from those who had come to the zoo. This reasoning did not impress me. The two groups were identical in every way but this, that one group talked amongst themselves, and the other talked to me. Even the sound of the talking was the same. It had to be something else. The following night I attacked the problem again, reasoning in this way. If nothing has changed in me, and nothing has changed in them, then something else is italicized, must have changed. I am the same, and they are the same. Therefore, something else is not the same. Looking at the matter this way, I could see only one answer. At the zoo, there were many gorillas, but here there was only one. I felt the force of this, but could not imagine why visitors would behave one way in the presence of many gorillas and a different way in the presence of one gorilla. The next day I tried to pay more attention to what my visitors were saying. I soon noticed that, although every speech was different, there was one sound that occurred over and over. It seemed to be intended to attract my attention. Of course, I was unable to hazard a guess as to its meaning. I possessed nothing that would serve as a Rosetta Stone. You folks know what that is, Rosetta Stone? You can look it up, but it's an artifact from ancient Egypt that could help you translate languages from that era. The wagon to the right of mine was occupied by a female chimpanzee with, I think that's correct anyways, you can fact check. Female chimpanzee with an infant, and I had already observed that visitors spoke to her the same way they spoke to me. Now I noticed that visitors employed a different recurrent sound to attract her attention. At her wagon, visitors called out, "Zaza, Zaza, Zaza." At my wagon, they called out, "Goliath, Goliath, Goliath." By small steps such as these, I soon understood that these sounds, in some mysterious way, attached directly to the two of us as individuals. You, who have had a name from birth and who probably think that even a pet dog is aware of having a name, which is untrue, cannot imagine what a revolution in perception the acquisition of a name produced in me. It would be no exaggeration to say that I was truly born in that moment, born as a person. From the realization that I had a name to the realization that everything has a name was not a great leap. You might think a caged animal would have little opportunity to learn the language of its visitors, but this is not so. Menageries attract families, and I soon discovered that parents were incessantly schooling their children in the arts of language. "Look, Johnny, there's a duck. Can you say duck? Duck. Do you know what a duck says? A duck says quack, quack." Within a couple of years, I was able to follow most conversations within earshot. But I found that puzzlement kept pace with comprehension. I knew by now that I was a gorilla and that Zaza was a chimpanzee. I also knew that all the inhabitants of the wagons were animals. But I could not quite make out the constitution of an animal. Our human visitors clearly distinguished between themselves and animals, but I was unable to figure out why. If I understood what made us animals, and I thought I did, I couldn't understand what made them not animals. Pondering, right? That's powerful. That's another powerful line and realization there, bottom of chapter 16, page 16 rather. The nature of our captivity was no longer a mystery, for I had heard it explained to hundreds of children. All the animals of the menagerie had originally lived in something called the wild, capitalized, which extended all over the world, whatever a world might be. We had been taken from the wild and brought together in one place because, for some strange reason, people found us interesting. We were kept in cages because we were wild and dangerous, terms that baffled me, because they evidently referred to qualities I epitomized in myself. I mean that when parents wanted to show their children a particularly wild and dangerous creature, they would point at me. It's true that they would also point at the big cats, but since I'd never seen a big cat outside a cage, this was not enlightening. On the whole, life at the menagerie was an improvement over life at the zoo, because it was not so oppressively boring. It didn't occur to me to be resentful of my keepers. Although they had a greater range of movement, they seemed as much bound to the menagerie as the rest of us, and I had no inkling that they lived an entirely different sort of life on the outside. It would have been as plausible for Boyle's law to have popped into my head as the notion that I had been unjustly deprived of some inborn right, such as the right to live as I pleased. Perhaps 3 or 4 years passed. Then one rainy day, when the lot was deserted, I received a peculiar visitor, a lone man, who looked to be ancient and shriveled to me, but who I later learned was only in his early 40s. Even his approach was distinctive. He stood at the entrance to the menagerie, glanced methodically at each wagon in turn, and then headed straight for me, for mine. He paused at the rope slung some 5 feet away, planted the tip of his walking stick in the mud just ahead of his shoes, and peered intently into my eyes. I've never been so disconcerted by a human gaze, so I placidly returned his stare. I sat, and he stood for several minutes without moving. I remember feeling an unusual admiration for this man, so stoically enduring the drizzle that was streaming down his face, soaking his clothes. At last he straightened up, gave me a nod, as if he'd come to some carefully considered conclusion. "You are not Goliath," he said. At that, he turned and marched back the way he'd come, without a look to the right or left. That's the end of the chapter. But I think you want to go on, right? I kind of want to go on. This is great storytelling. This gorilla is a fantastic storyteller. And I just love seeing him discover these concepts we take for granted. I think you've seen this as a pattern if you watch me read The Giver. Very similar sort of feeling here. It's fun to chase this in various stories. Chapter 4, shall we? I was thunderstruck, as you may well imagine. Not Goliath? What could it possibly mean to be not Goliath? It didn't occur to me to say, well, if I'm not Goliath, then who am I? A human would ask this question because he would know that, whatever his name, he is assuredly someone. I did not. On the contrary, it seemed to me that if I was not Goliath, then I must be no one at all. Though this stranger had never laid eyes on me before that day, I don't doubt for a moment that he spoke with an unquestionable authority. 1,000 others have called me by the name of Goliath, even those who, like the workers at the menagerie, knew me well, but that was clearly not the point. Counted for nothing. The stranger hadn't said, "Your name is not Goliath." He had said, "You are not Goliath." There was a world of difference. As I felt it, though I could not have expressed it in this way at the time, my awareness of selfhood had been pronounced a delusion. I drifted into a sort of fugue state, neither aware nor unconscious. An attendant came round with food, but I ignored him. Night fell, but I didn't sleep. The rain stopped and the sun rose without my noticing. Soon there were the usual crowds of visitors calling out, "Goliath! Goliath! Goliath!" But I paid no attention. Several days passed in this way. Then one evening, after the menagerie had closed for the day, I took a long drink from my bowl and soon fell asleep. A powerful sedative had been added to my water. At dawn I awoke in an unfamiliar cage. At first, because it was so large and so strangely shaped, I didn't even recognize it as a cage. In fact, it was circular and open to the air on all sides. As I later understood, a gazebo had been modified to serve the purpose. Except for a large, white house nearby, it stood alone in the midst of an attractive park that I imagined must extend to the ends of the earth. It was not long before I conceived an explanation for the strange translocation. The people who visited the menagerie came, at least in part, with the expectation of seeing a gorilla named Goliath. How they came to this expectation I could not guess, but they certainly seemed to have it. And when the owner of the menagerie learned that I was in fact not Goliath, he could scarcely go on exhibiting me as such, and so had no real choice but to send me away. I didn't know whether to be sorry about this or not. My new home was far more pleasant than anything I had seen since leaving Africa. But without the daily stimulation of crowds, it would soon become even more excruciatingly boring than the zoo, where at least I'd had the company of other gorillas. I was still pondering these matters when, around mid-morning, I looked up and saw that I was not alone. A man was standing just beyond the bars, blackly silhouetted against the sunlit house in the distance. I approached cautiously and was astonished to recognize him. As if reenacting our former encounter, we gazed into each other's eyes for several minutes. I was sitting on the floor of my cage. He was leaning on his walking stick. I saw that, dry and freshly dressed, he was not the elderly person I'd first taken him for. His face was long and dark and bony. His eyes burned with a strange intensity, and his mouth seemed set in an expression of bitter mirth. At last he nodded exactly as before and said, "Yes, I was right. You are not Goliath. You are Ishmael." Once again, as if everything that mattered was now finally settled, he turned and walked away. Once again, and once again, I was thunderstruck, but this time by a feeling of profound relief, for I had been redeemed from oblivion. More, the error that caused me to live as an unwitting impostor for so many years had been corrected at last. I had been made whole as a person, not again, but for the very first time, because this man is telling him, "This is your true name." I was consumed with curiosity about my savior. I didn't think to associate him with my removal from the menagerie to this charming Belvedere, for I was as yet incapable of even the most primitive of fallacies. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc. He was to me a supernal being. To a mind ready for mythology, he was the beginning of what is meant by godlike. He had twice made a brief appearance in my life, and twice, with a single utterance, had transformed me. I tried to search for the underlying meaning of these appearances, but found only questions. Had this man come to the menagerie in search of Goliath, or in search of me? Had he come because he hoped I was Goliath, or because he suspected I was not Goliath? How had he so promptly found me in my new location? I had no measure of the extent of human information. If it was common knowledge that I could be found at the menagerie, as it had seemed to be, was it also common knowledge that I could now be found here? Despite all these unanswerable questions, the overwhelming fact remained that this uncanny creature had twice sought me out in order to address me in an unprecedented way. As a person, I was certain that, having finally settled the matter of my identity, he would vanish from my life forever. What more was there for him to do? Doubtless you will have surmised that all these breathless apperceptions were just so much moonshine. Nonetheless, the truth, as I later learned it, was not much less fantastic. My benefactor was a wealthy Jewish merchant of this city, a man by the name of Walter Sokolow. On the day he discovered me at the menagerie, he'd been out walking in the rain, in a kind of suicidal gloom that had descended on him a few months before, when he had learned beyond any doubt that his entire family had been swallowed up in the Nazi Holocaust. His wanderings led him to a carnival set up at the edge of town, and he went in with nothing in particular on his mind Because of the rain, most of the booths and rides were shut down, giving the place an air of abandonment that accorded well with his melancholy. At last, he came to the menagerie, whose chief attractions were advertised in a series of lurid paintings. One of these, more lurid than the rest, depicted the gorilla Goliath, brandishing the broken body of an African native as if it were a weapon. Walter Sokolow, perhaps thinking that a gorilla named Goliath was an apt symbol for the Nazi giant that it was then engaged in crushing the race of David, decided it would be satisfying to behold such a monster behind bars. He went in, approached my wagon, and by gazing into my eyes, soon realized that I was no relation to the bloodthirsty monster in the painting, and indeed no relation to the Philistine tormentor of his race. He found it gave him no satisfaction whatever to see me behind bars. On the contrary, in a quixotic gesture of guilt and defiance, he decided to rescue me from my cage and fashion me into a dreadful substitute for the family he had failed to rescue from the cage of Europe. Wow! Halfway down page 22. The owner of the menagerie was agreeable to a sale. He was even glad to let Mr. Sokolow hire away a handler who had looked after me since my arrival. The owner was a realist. With America's inevitable entrance into the war, traveling shows like his were either going to spend the duration in winter quarters or simply become extinct. After letting me settle in for a day in my new surroundings, Mr. Sokolow returned to begin to make my acquaintance. He wanted the handler to show him how everything was done, from mixing my feed to cleaning my cage. He asked him if he thought I was dangerous. The handler said I was like a piece of heavy machinery, dangerous not by disposition, but by dint of sheer size and power. Nice. After an hour or so, Mr. Sokolow sent him away, and we gazed at each other in a long silence as we had already done twice before. Finally, reluctantly, as if surmounting some daunting interior barrier, he began to speak to me, not in the jocular way of visitors to the menagerie, but rather as one speaks to the wind, or to the waves crashing on a beach, uttering that which must be said, but which must not be heard by anyone. As he poured out his sorrows and self-recriminations, he gradually forgot the need for caution. By the time an hour had passed, he was propped up against my cage with a hand wrapped around a bar. He was looking at the ground, lost in thought, and I used this opportunity to express my sympathy, reaching out and gently stroking the knuckles of his hand. He leapt back, startled and horrified, but a search of my eyes reassured him that my gesture was as innocent of menace as it seemed. Alerted by this experience, he began to suspect that I possessed real intelligence, and a few simple tests were enough to convince him of this. Having proved that I understood his words, he leaped to the conclusions, as others were later to do in working with other primates, that I should be able to produce some of my own. In short, he decided to teach me to talk. I will pass over the painful and humiliating months that followed. Neither one of us understood that the difficulty was insurmountable, owing to a lack of basic phonic equipment on my part. In the absence of that understanding, we both labored on under the impression that the knack would someday magically manifest itself in me if we persevered. But at last there came a day when I couldn't go on, and in my anguish at not being able to tell him this, I thought him this with all the mental power I possessed. He was stunned, as was I when I saw that he'd heard my mental cry. I won't burden you with all the steps of our progress once full communication was established between us, since they are easily imagined, I believe. Over the next decade, He taught me all he knew of the world and the universe and human history. And when my questions were beyond his knowledge, we studied side by side. And when my studies carried me beyond his own interests at last, he cheerfully became my research assistant, tracking down books and information in places that were, of course, beyond my reach. With the new interest of my education to absorb his attention, my benefactor soon forgot to torment himself with remorse, and so gradually recovered from his gloom. By the early 60s, I was like a house guest who needed very little attention from his host, so Mr. Socolow began to allow himself to be rediscovered in social circles, with the not unpredictable result that he soon found himself in the hands of a young woman of 40 who saw no reason why he could not be made into a satisfactory sort of husband. In fact, he was not at all adverse to marriage, but he made the terrible mistake in anticipation of it. He decided that our special relationship should be kept a secret from his wife. It was not an extraordinary decision for those times, and I was not sufficiently experienced in such matters to recognize it for the error it was. I moved back into the gazebo as soon as it had been renovated to accommodate the civilized habits I had acquired. From the first, however, Mrs. Socolow viewed me as a peculiar and alarming pet, and began agitating for my speedy removal and disposal. Luckily, my benefactor was used to having his own way, and made it clear that no amount of pleading or coercion could change the situation he'd created for me. A few months after the wedding, he dropped in to tell me that his wife, like Abraham's Sarah, was soon going to present him with a child of his old age. "I anticipated nothing like this when I named you Ishmael," he told me. "Rest assured I won't let her cast you out of my house the way Sarah cast your namesake out of Abraham's house." Nevertheless, it amused him to say that, if it was a boy, he would name him Isaac. As matters turned out, however, it was a girl, and they named her Rachel. And that's the end of the chapter, folks. We got through a couple tonight. Again, forgive the stumbles, but we're keeping it real. We're just hanging out together, getting through the story. How cool is this? I just you don't get this perspective anywhere else. I think the writing is superb. I'm drawn in. And now what's going to happen? I think his situation is in deep trouble. I can't quite remember. I told you it's been years since I read this. I did not read ahead. We're discovering this together. So hope you enjoyed that. More to come. And like I said, without any sort of editing or filters like you saw in the first chapter, lesson learned there. So let me know what you think. Drop me a comment, and I'll see you on the next one.